What if the long reign of a single beloved queen masked a brewing political and religious storm? A storm that would shatter the structure of government, end a king's life, and fundamentally reshape the world. In 1603, the Stuart dynasty ascended the English throne, marking the dawn of a deeply uncertain age for the nation. For a period spanning 4.5 decades, Queen Elizabeth I had provided an unparalleled era of stability, a length of time so vast that the overwhelming majority of the English populace had literally known no other monarch or style of governance. But her passing left a profound void. The economic and political landscape, coupled with intense and ever-shifting religious pressures, meant that James I inherited a crown, facing an entirely new set of monumental challenges during his reign. Pressures that would, with frightening speed, throw the entirety of England into a state of deep turmoil and unprecedented conflict. In this exhaustive historical deep dive, we will meticulously follow England as it grapples with the intense friction of Civil War revolutionary fervor and radical political upheaval, all while simultaneously and strategically establishing the robust, complex, and enduring foundations of its vast and powerful global empire. This is the full story. To truly grasp the dynamics of this revolutionary period, we must first look to the burgeoning power of Parliament. This legislative body had been steadily accumulating influence and authority for literally centuries, tracing its roots back to its earliest days of contentious consultation with the Crown over essential matters like taxes. Notably for funding the relentless 100 Years' War, Parliament had, by the time the Stuarts arrived, become a powerful, sophisticated, and absolutely integral part of the English government. The Tudors, masters of political maneuvering, had skillfully leveraged Parliament's legitimacy to secure public and legal support for their major, potentially controversial policies. Think of monumental shifts, like Henry VIII's break with Rome and Elizabeth's complex religious reforms. However, a significant element within this body, an element that was growing both in size and conviction, was the increasingly powerful Puritan membership. These reformers vehemently wished Elizabeth had pushed the Church of England much further into Protestantism, and saw the dawn of a new dynasty as their chance. The ascension of the Stuarts, therefore, became a golden opportunity for Parliament to strategically assert and dramatically expand its already considerable and rapidly growing authority over the king himself. It's in this environment that James I found himself in constant, escalating friction with the legislative institution almost immediately. Lacking an existing widespread network of loyalists or connections from which he could effectively draw to manage and control the deeply entrenched parliamentary factions, James was immediately at a disadvantage. Furthermore, Parliament was disproportionately Puritan in its composition when compared to the general population, meaning the more moderate James already had his work cut out for him simply to achieve religious and political equilibrium. There was one fleeting moment of national unity: the unified and ferocious response to the infamous gunpowder plot in November 1605. This Catholic conspiracy, led by Guy Fawkes, aimed to literally blow up the Palace of Westminster while the king and the entire Parliament were in attendance. However, that shared purpose, born of fear, quickly evaporated. James's reign was characterized by his lavish spending, which created a relentless and urgent demand for money, funds that Parliament was increasingly reluctant and unwilling to grant. James's solution was to try and circumvent Parliament entirely. He unilaterally raised customs duties, compelled wealthy men to accept forced loans, and granted lucrative monopolies to his chosen private individuals or companies, circumventing the need for parliamentary approval. Parliament viewed these actions as fundamentally illegal and promptly issued strong protests. The ongoing financial dispute led James to dissolve Parliament in both 1610 and 1614. Yet, this time, the institution was not easily intimidated. In a landmark assertion of its power in 1624, Parliament passed the Act of Monopolies, designed specifically to end the king's deeply resented power to grant private monopolies to whomever he pleased. This was the first documented instance where Parliament had successfully legislated away a specific power of the king, and both sides knew it would not be the last. The constitutional conflict was now in the open, but it would take James's son to bring it to a devastating climax. It was under Charles I, however, that these deep-seated issues with Parliament would tragically boil over and ultimately consume the country in a catastrophic civil war. Much like his father before him, Charles quickly frustrated the ruling elite in Parliament with his renewed and aggressive attempts to raise money without its essential and legally required permission. The Crown certainly retained the power over war and peace, yet Charles's politically dubious decision to engage in wars with both France and Spain simultaneously was intensely unpopular. Parliament predictably resisted his attempts to raise taxes to pay for this massive military undertaking. Charles's response was a new round of forced loans, compelling wealthy men, many of them powerful members of Parliament themselves, to hand over money under duress or face immediate imprisonment. This was not a minor inconvenience. Dozens of powerful, wealthy men were treated as criminals for refusing what they viewed as an illegal tax. Crucially, Charles's actions also alienated the common people, particularly in the south of England. He effectively declared martial law and seized citizens' private homes to forcibly billet the militia he was raising for the war. This was viewed as an intolerable violation of private liberty and a direct abuse of royal power. In 1628, Parliament responded directly and forcefully to these abuses with the Petition of Right. This document was a landmark moment in English political thought, establishing core principles of individual liberty. No one should be compelled to pay any tax, loan, or gift that had not been voted on by Parliament. No one would be imprisoned without knowing the specific charges against them, the principle of habeas corpus. Soldiers should not be forcibly billeted in private homes against the will of the homeowner, and martial law would not be declared in peacetime. The Petition of Right defined the fundamental English idea of freedom and liberty, a freedom from an arbitrary and unaccountable government that could abuse its own citizens without regard for their established rights. The king was being legally confined, but this profound legal challenge did not deter Charles. Instead, he simply dissolved Parliament the following year. For the next 11 years, Charles ruled solely by royal prerogative, deliberately avoiding the nuisance of Parliament altogether. This period, known as the 11 Years' Tyranny, saw him continue to raise customs duties, unilaterally reinstitute ancient medieval forest laws, and, most notably, implement a nationwide ship tax. This tax, historically only levied on coastal counties for naval defense, was expanded to inland counties. His subsequent imprisonment of those who refused to pay it turned Charles from a typical monarch in political conflict to an absolutist king who posed a direct and existential danger to the fundamental rule of law in England. This state of affairs could not last. Parliament was not summoned again until 1640, a desperate move made only because Charles urgently needed funding to suppress a volatile rebellion that had broken out in Scotland over Charles's attempts to impose the English prayer book. This new Parliament, however, was out for systemic, lasting change. They immediately forced Charles to accept a commitment that Parliament must meet at least once every 3 years, fundamentally limiting the king's ability to rule alone. They quickly began impeachment proceedings against several of Charles's most loyal and controversial ministers, most importantly, Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, who was ultimately condemned and executed for abuses of power committed in Ireland. Charles reluctantly agreed to sign the death warrant, a betrayal of a loyal servant that he came to profoundly regret. Compounding this constitutional crisis was the religious one. Charles was an Arminian, a moderate faction within the Church of England who revered high ceremony and grandeur and favored the continued existence of bishops. This was utterly intolerable to the predominantly puritanical Parliament, who came to view Charles as little better than a Catholic in disguise. The final fatal rupture came in 1641, when a major rebellion broke out in Ireland. Both King and Parliament vehemently insisted on controlling the militia raised to put down the uprising. Each side, rightly fearing the other, would use this armed force to seize absolute and permanent power. By this point, the relationship between the two sides was utterly unsalvageable. Parliament declared its control of the militia under a Lord General. Charles's enraged response on January 4, 1642, was a shocking, naked display of royal power. He marched into the House of Commons with armed men, demanding the arrest of 5 leading members of Parliament. All 5 had already fled. Parliament would not have surrendered them even if they had been present. This unconstitutional act of aggression and the equally firm parliamentary resistance was the literal proverbial Rubicon. There was no solution left but all-out war. Charles fled London for York, where he began the process of raising an army of his own. Parliament, in turn, formalized its control of the militia and called up troops. The First English Civil War was now a reality fought between the Royalists known as the Cavaliers, a nickname drawn from the high number of aristocratic cavalry officers, and the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads, named for the shorter rounded haircuts popular among their troops. Geographically, the north and west of England plus Wales generally rallied to the Royalist cause, while the south and east solidly supported Parliament. Charles initially appeared to have the upper hand, scoring the first major victory at the Battle of Edgehill in October 1642, but he critically failed to press his advantage onto London. The next year, the Royalists won more victories at locations like Bristol and Newbury. However, the tide irrevocably turned against them in 1644 with the arrival of a powerful Scottish army to aid Parliament. The Royalists suffered a grave and costly defeat at the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644. The climactic moment came at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645, which delivered an unrecoverable, crushing defeat upon the Royalist army, effectively destroying its core fighting capability. Momentum now shifted fully to Parliament, which proceeded to capture the Royalist headquarters at Oxford the following year. Charles eventually fled north, surrendering to the Scots, who subsequently handed him over to Parliament. By the time the organized fighting stopped, a staggering 300,000 people had been killed. The capture of King Charles effectively ended the First Civil War, but it immediately gave rise to a new, unsettling political reality: the formidable power of the army that had defeated him. This faction, led by the increasingly influential Oliver Cromwell, was even more aggressively Puritan in its religious zeal than Parliament itself, and had gained immense political power through its wartime service. Despite his defeat, Charles remained the king and was held under house arrest for almost 2 years, while Parliament struggled to decide his fate. The rising power of Cromwell's army was viewed with profound unease by the civilian parliamentarians. This tension boiled over in 1648, when a fresh and dangerous wave of royalist uprisings broke out. Cromwell swiftly and brutally crushed them within months. This experience confirmed his conviction. Charles's mere existence posed a permanent, destabilizing threat to any new order Parliament hoped to build. In December 1648, Cromwell and his allies, backed by the army, forcibly seized control of Parliament, drove out the moderate members in what became known as Pride's Purge, and moved to try the king for treason. They argued that in abusing his constitutional power, Charles had committed an offense against God, the law, and the nation, the 3 entities he was sworn to serve. The trial itself was essentially a farce. Parliament's legal basis was nascent and undeveloped. The conclusion was foregone. and Charles did not even dignify the court with a response to the charges, famously refusing to recognize its authority. On January 26, 1649, Charles was condemned to death for high treason. 4 days later, on January 30, 1649, the King of England lost his head on a scaffold erected outside Whitehall Palace. With the king's execution, England was immediately declared a Commonwealth, a republic, with Parliament theoretically holding the sole authority. The political turbulence, however, continued. Cromwell spent the next few years ruthlessly suppressing remaining royalist threats, first in Ireland. His campaign there was marked by extreme brutality toward the Catholic population, including massacres and the mass seizure and redistribution of Irish land to his allies. He was only slightly gentler to the Protestant Scots, whom he marched against in 1650, after they declared Charles's exiled son, Charles II, as their king. Yet, by 1653, Cromwell grew weary of an ineffective and obstructive parliament, so he abruptly dissolved it. Declaring himself Lord Protector, Cromwell established what was, in all but name, a military dictatorship. With financial independence secured and the unwavering loyalty of the new model army, there was nothing Parliament could do to stop him. Cromwell aggressively implemented a severe puritanical order across England. His appointed regional major generals acted as moral police, instituting sweeping moral laws, banning gambling, enforcing severe fines for public drunkenness and obscenity, and punishing anyone who worked on the Sabbath. However pious and religiously driven he was, almost everyone in England came to agree that Cromwell was far more oppressive and unpopular than Charles I had ever been. Parliament despised him. The average Englishman ridiculed the absurdity of some of his most extreme laws, such as the banning of traditional Christmas decorations and even women's cosmetics. His reign was so profoundly detested that even those committed to the parliamentary cause began longing for the old monarchy. When Cromwell finally died in 1658, his son Richard was quickly and easily sidelined. The unthinkable occurred. Parliament, eager to restore order and escape military rule, invited the exiled Charles II, whose father they had executed barely a decade earlier, to return to the throne. Charles II returned to London in a triumphal and emotional celebration on May 29, 1660. The monarchy was restored, but the country and the crown would never again be the same. Parliament had, through decades of conflict, permanently secured its supremacy over the crown. The ideals of a limited government, responsible to its people and accountable to the higher principles of common law and the rights of Englishmen, was now an indelible fixture of political thought. These dramatic reforms at home unfolded simultaneously with a massive and unprecedented expansion abroad, forming what historians label the First British Empire. The colonization of Ulster in Ireland, initially sponsored by the Crown, preceded the mass seizure of Irish land under Cromwell. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the first lasting English colony in the Americas was successfully established at Virginia. Despite the immense challenges of early settlement, a steady stream of new colonists followed. Crucially, the start of tobacco cultivation in 1612 instantly made the colony economically profitable. In 1620, English Puritans, fiercely dissatisfied with the religious climate at home, landed at Plymouth Rock aboard the Mayflower. By the time the Civil War broke out decades later, over 50,000 English people had already traveled to the Americas. English colonization was not a single, coordinated central effort. It was a piecemeal effort, primarily driven by private individuals migrating for a wide variety of intensely personal reasons. For the Pilgrims, it was a religious venture to escape restrictions and build a deeply Protestant society of their own. Other settlers were motivated by the very same arguments against governmental tyranny and for freedom from taxation that had contributed to the Civil War itself. Frontier life also offered the potent promise of land ownership, a commodity that was in scarce supply for common people back in England. The clear economic success of the American colonies only accelerated the flow of settlers eager to make their fortunes. The administration of these colonies was equally varied. Royal colonies, such as Virginia and New York, were managed directly by the Crown and its appointed officials. Proprietor colonies like Pennsylvania and Maryland were privately owned and typically elected their own leaders. Charter colonies occupied a middle ground, where the Crown granted private settlers or companies the right to settle an area. England largely relied on local colonial officials to collect taxes and upon its own soldiers to maintain order. However, England's influence on daily affairs was severely limited by sheer distance. This de facto freedom from English oversight allowed the American colonies to develop their own distinct culture, one that emphasized freedom, autonomy, and minimal government intervention, a set of values that would inevitably challenge the English crown in the next century. Maintaining these expanding colonies led to significant conflict. The first party encountered were the Native Americans who already inhabited the land. Native settler relations varied hugely based on the specific native group, the specific settlers, and the time period. In the early years, the small number of colonists often favored trade and cooperation. However, by the late 17th and early 18th century, the rapidly growing settlements became aggressive in displacing and destroying native communities. English law did not recognize native land claims, and new colonists had no qualms about violently clearing the Native Americans off their desired land. This led to several brutal conflicts, such as the Pequot War of the 1630s and King Philip's War of the 1670s, named for the Pokanoket chief Metacom, who took the English name Philip. The English also clashed with other European powers, chiefly France, who were also aggressively colonizing the Americas. Conflicts that originated in Europe often played out violently in the colonies, with wars over resources and land becoming common. Native Americans often found themselves caught between these warring European powers. Most famously, the Iroquois Confederacy strategically allied themselves with the English after decades of conflict with the French, known as the Beaver Wars. Aside from the continental colonies, the Caribbean colonies were vital to England's new empire. The production of extremely valuable goods, especially sugar, powered primarily by slave labor, made these islands some of the most lucrative possessions of the Crown. Protecting these colonies and the shipments of goods coming back from Spanish and French competitors encouraged massive strategic investment in the Navy and spurred significant improvements in naval tactics, allowing the Royal Navy to dominate the sea. Unfortunately, this wealth also resulted in large numbers of highly skilled sailors turning to piracy to prey upon the rich colonies and ships. The infamous Golden Age of piracy raged from the 1650s to the 1730s, directly fueled by the riches offered from England's Caribbean colonies. Now, we cannot talk about the colonization of the Americas without directly addressing England's integral and terrible role in the Atlantic slave trade. The new colonies needed far more laborers than the number of voluntary settlers. With naval technology advanced enough to make reliable trips to Africa, England quickly found its forced labor source. The Portuguese were the first to open the Atlantic slave trade, but the British quickly became one of its major industrialized players. The weak native states along Africa's west coast were easy picking for slavers. Most often, the British traded with native Africans, offering manufactured goods like guns and wealth in exchange for human beings. Those human beings then had to endure the several week-long horrific ordeal of the Atlantic Passage before settling in for a miserable, unfree life in a distant land with little to no hope of escape. The slave trade remained physically distant from most English people. Slavery on English soil had been banned for centuries, though African slaves did find their way there as domestic servants or during transit. An Englishman would not walk down the street and expect to see a slave working in the fields. However, as the products of slave labor in the colonies, such as sugar and tobacco, flowed into England during the Stuart period, slavery had a massive, indirect economic impact on everyone's daily lives, whether they consciously thought about it or not. Beyond the Atlantic, the Stuart period also saw England make its first, careful inroads into India. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins arrived at the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir as the first official envoy for England in the subcontinent. Relations were warm at first. The Mughals were happy to trade with the English, and England's displays of strength in muscling out rival European powers, like the Dutch and French, convinced the Mughals to grant them special privileges. The East India Company, EIC, was granted trading posts known as factories, starting with Surat in 1612, and gained many more over the following decades. Wealthier Englishmen who held stock in the EIC made a fortune off this trade. Access to the most precious commodity of all, tea, was welcomed. When tea arrived at the court of Charles II, it was an extreme luxury available only to the elite. But it soon spread to the other levels of society, becoming a national obsession. While Charles II restored normalcy, the historical role of the monarch, and of all monarchs after him, was definitively less than that of his predecessors. To understand English history from here on out, we need to look even further beyond the palaces and parliament to the intellectuals and innovators. The same curiosity that fueled global exploration drove an English scientific revolution. In medicine, for example, William Harvey revolutionized the understanding of the human body with his groundbreaking insights into the heart and blood circulation. The true, towering icon of the English scientific revolution was Isaac Newton. A mathematical genius, Newton's ideas on gravity and the laws of motion became the absolute cornerstone of humanity's understanding of the physical world. He also developed calculus, a landmark moment in the story of mathematics. England was also simultaneously experiencing an agricultural revolution through the 17th century. With improved plow designs, the introduction of essential winter crops like turnips, new field rotation systems, and the application of fertilizers, English agricultural productivity soared. By 1720, England's agricultural output was an astounding 5 times what it had been in 1420. Famines were now a grim thing of the past. The average Englishman could now expect to enjoy meat regularly, and if he lived in the cities, he would find tobacco, tea, and coffee as regular fixtures of his day. Complementing these changes was the burgeoning financial revolution, with England wholeheartedly embracing joint stock companies and sophisticated modern banking that would rapidly make it the commercial hub of the world. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, signaling a new level of complexity and interest in the financial landscape. A more individualistic, capitalistic economy was emerging where the freedom of man to sell his labor and land, free from duty or obligation to any other, was now the accepted rule. The social elite were now defined not by the number of men at their command or the acreage of their ancestral lands, but by the profits their commercial companies generated. The government aggressively supported these traders, keen to establish a favorable balance of trade with the rest of the world. By 1700, England had decisively overtaken the Dutch to become the single greatest trading power in the world by volume. These immense internal shifts were about to be tested by another defining political upheaval, the Glorious Revolution. Charles II's popular reign ended in 1685, and he was replaced by his much less popular brother, James II. James was the one thing 17th century England could not tolerate in a monarch. He was a Catholic. Parliament had previously tried to bar him from the succession, but Charles had taken advantage of parliamentary disunity to secure his brother's succession. James ruled for only 3 years. During that time, he tried to appoint Catholics to key positions of power, and, quite fairly, rolled back the severe persecution of Catholics. This wouldn't do for the fiercely Protestant Parliament, but this time they would not repeat the violent mistakes of 1642. Instead, Parliament secretly contacted James's Protestant daughter Mary, who was married to the Dutch ruler William of Orange. An alliance of political leaders begged William and Mary to invade and replace the unpopular James. Eager to bring England into an ongoing war with France, William agreed. On November 5, 1688, William and Mary's army landed in southern England. James scrambled to raise his army, but when people realized what was truly happening, they abandoned James in droves. There was no battle. James was allowed to flee, and William and Mary peacefully proceeded to London to replace him. The Glorious Revolution had successfully ended the last Catholic monarch of England without a single shot fired. The Glorious Revolution demonstrated the enormous political progress England had made. Only a century before, religious differences would have led to open rebellion and mass persecution. Now, the institutions of Parliament and the Crown were strong enough, and the people's faith in them sufficiently robust, that they could contain a destabilizing issue that might have destroyed an earlier England, and resolve it without bloodshed. What remains most remarkable about this settlement is that the full workings of England's political system were never formally clarified. England remains one of the few major nations that operates on an unwritten constitution. There is no single, consolidated document that outlines the specific powers of the Crown or of Parliament. England's political constitution is instead drawn from a complex mix of statute law, founding documents like Magna Carta, key legal decisions, common law, and unwritten traditions and conventions. This flexibility allowed the balance of power between Parliament and the Crown to continually evolve. After the Glorious Revolution, the relative powers of the Crown and Parliament would continue to evolve on this unique, unwritten basis. As the 18th century dawned, things were relatively stable for England at home. The accession of Queen Anne in 1701 went smoothly. The greatest domestic disruption of her reign, the Acts of Union of 1707, which consolidated the crowns of England, and Scotland into the new Kingdom of Great Britain, were generally well received. Ireland remained a separate kingdom, and Wales was counted under England, which explains the absence of Irish or Welsh symbolism on the Union Jack flag. The major domestic disturbance of the early 18th century was the threat posed by the Jacobites, Catholic supporters of the deposed James II, who wanted to restore the Catholic branch of the Stuart family. The ascension of the German King George of the Hanover dynasty following Anne's death in 1714 caused two failed uprisings by the Jacobites in 1715 and 1719. The danger they posed, however, came more from foreign backing than any serious threat to England's internal order. In Parliament, politicians had informally coalesced into two political parties. The Tories, a nickname drawn from Irish horse thieves, represented the more traditional and conservative attitude, with deep respect for the monarchy and Anglicanism. Against them stood the Whigs, taking their name from Scottish rebels, who were more associated with parliamentary power, limited monarchy, anti-Catholicism, and nonconformism. The Whigs dominated politics in the early 18th century, and no figure represented that dominance better than Sir Robert Walpole, whose control over government affairs from 1721 to 1742 has earned him the unofficial title of Britain's first Prime Minister. That's the unwritten constitution at work again. England's greatest struggles, however, occurred far from its shores. In 1740, they were roped into the War of the Austrian Succession. The constantly shifting alliances and convoluted claims of the participants are less relevant to the English story than the war's ultimate impact: the hugely increased tax burden needed to fund it. It did, however, provide a crucial arena for the British to sharpen the military and naval tactics that would serve them so well in the decades to come. In 1743, George II became the last king to personally witness these tactics firsthand at the Battle of Dettingen, making him the last English monarch ever to lead his armies into battle. With the troops occupied abroad, the Jacobites attempted one final desperate attempt to seize the throne in 1745 for James II's grandson, the Bonnie Prince Charlie, but it failed dramatically, ringing the death knell for the Jacobite cause forever. The respite was brief. Hot on the heels of the War of the Austrian Succession came the 7 Years' War, fought primarily against France starting in 1756. This was a war fought far from British soil, playing out across various colonies across the globe, in what some historians have correctly described as the first truly world war. This war had two massive and immediate consequences. First, the immense cost nearly bankrupted Britain, which it would try to recover by taxing its American colonies, a move that would famously backfire. Second, was the dramatic extension of the fighting to India. By now, the EIC had dozens of factories and thousands of private troops supporting its trade, enough to pose a serious threat to Indian rulers. British efforts against the French in India as part of the war angered the ruler of Bengal in 1756, prompting a regional war. Britain crushed the Bengali army at the Battle of Plassey, and subsequently installed a puppet ruler over Bengal. The age of England's Indian Empire had arrived and was taking its first steps. England had come through centuries of devastating civil wars, revolutions, and intense religious strife. The experience had hardened its political institutions, inspired its intellectual thought, and propelled its ships and settlers around the world, raising its flag from Boston in the Americas to Bengal in India. The sun had truly risen on the British Empire. England had emerged from this crucible a stronger, more complex, and more globally dominant nation. The struggles between Crown and Parliament would define its internal politics, while its aggressive expansion overseas would define its destiny. Join us next time as we witness the dramatic, world-altering events that followed this expansion, including the rebellion in the American colonies. To ensure you don't miss that gripping continuation, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell notification button. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video. It helps us tremendously. Remember, this compelling historical animation is designed to make the past engaging and entertaining, and all content is based on the research of respected historians, with references shown on screen. Stay tuned for the next chapter.